Hi, everyone. My name's Amy Wolf, and I am the programming coordinator for the Osterville Village Library. I'm so excited that you guys decided to come out on this gorgeous Friday, no rain in sight. Can you believe it? We are thrilled to have the Cape Cod Maritime Museum here to share with us Cape Cod's connection to the Titanic.
Great. Can everybody hear me okay? All right. I'm usually a loud and fast talker, so if I ever start getting quiet or too fast, feel free to wave me down. But my name's Emily Sullivan. I'm the curator at the Cape Cod Maritime Museum. We are in Hyannis, located on South Street, right near the harbor. So if you haven't visited us, please come on down. We've got a lot of cool stuff to look at, and we are open year round. So, you know, we're not gonna have a deadline to get down there. So when I started at this position back in February of 2021, I came here as a former summer resident of the Cape. My grandparents used to own a house in Harwich and then later in Harwichport. And so, you know, as a little kid, I had a lot of cousins and I often got overruled for fun stuff we would do on weekends. So I didn't really have any fun. I was always a history kid, but none of my cousins were. So I didn't get to really engage with the Cape's interesting history until I got this job. And one of the things that I've found just fascinating and like really, you know, a privilege to work in this position is the Cape is, you know, this major or minor or significant player in so many different moments in history that we're all familiar with, but no one ever really talks about our specific connection to it. It's always, you know, other places kind of getting the glory, or, you know, we're sort of missing in the footnotes and stuff. And one of the stories that really hooked my attention when I first started was our minor but important role in the Titanic sinking in 1912. So this presentation is sort of a, you know, way to try and get that history out there to folks, talk about it a little bit, you know, hopefully just show we've got this cool local connection to this story that I'm sure you guys have heard a million times and, you know, seen the movie and all the documentaries and stuff like that. So this is, do you know Cape Cod is sending a batch of messages for you, the Cape's role in the sinking of the RMS Titanic. So let me just make sure I got the little clicker. Are you not going to work for me, buddy? Okay, we're good. All right. So I think everyone here knows that on April 14th, 1912, at around 11:40 p.m., the RMS Titanic hit an iceberg. The iceberg punctured several holes in the ship's hull, and less than 3 hours later, the ship hit the bottom of the ocean around 2:30 a.m. on April 15th. Of the 2,240 passengers and crew on board, more than 1,500 lost their lives in the disaster. But few of us on Cape or off know that the approximately 705 survivors of the most famous maritime disaster in history had a wireless station in Cape Cod to thank for their rescue, completely by chance. To get to that story, we're going to first roll the clock back a little and talk about one of the inventors of wireless technology. So at the turn of the 20th century, this man, Giacomo Marconi, was already a household name. After beginning experimenting with wireless transmission in 1894, he received his first patent for them in 1896 and created the world's first telegraph and signal company the following year. A major goal of his going into the new century, and also just for other folks involved in this industry, was improving long distance communication and specifically attempting to send a transatlantic message wirelessly. The world was already well connected with telegraph wires. That tech itself was not new at this point, but doing it wirelessly and figuring out how far radio waves could actually carry was a pretty exciting question that a lot of people were really eager to get to the bottom of. Marconi had already been involved with sending the first transatlantic wireless signal from England to New Brunswick. And with this in mind, he started scouting for a site for his first US-based station to get the ball rolling on, you know, making this happen, finding a way to see if we could get a signal all the way across the Atlantic. He considered locations in New York, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Massachusetts, hoping for something remote but not too far from civilization. And Cape Cod was fairly quickly identified as a perfect spot for this. We were, you know, close enough to the real world that you could get supplies and building materials and stuff like that, but it was pretty far away from major civilization. In early 1901, Marconi and his team arrived in Provincetown and was shown around by locals to scout potential sites. He was originally interested in some land near Highland Light and Truro, but locals refused to sell him the land. So his sights turned to Wellfleet and an 8-acre piece of land on top of a 330 or a 130-foot cliff. Sorry, I had to flip the numbers around in my head. It was a prime location. It was close to Wellfleet Harbor, as well as a radio station and telegraph office, but it wasn't too close to town. He bought the land from the Cook family for $250. So, you know, quite a lot of money in those days, but quite a bargain to us. Reportedly, locals were really unimpressed with Marconi the man, as he turned his nose up at local food options and had things instead imported from New York and Boston to snack on while he was there. He left the site in the hands of his chief engineer, and locals watched as cottages, a transmitter building, a kerosene engine, and an array of antennae, which is the first picture you see over here, mounted on 2,200-foot masts went up. These masts, while very, you know, impressive and dramatic, seemed very fragile to onlookers who predicted they wouldn't hold up well against the strong wind and rain of the Atlantic. Turns out they were right to be concerned, as a November storm toppled the towers, almost killing the chief engineer and badly damaging the transmitting room. So the station was quickly repaired and rebuilt, this time with 4 210-foot towers that supported the antenna. This postcard on the other side is the repaired station, and you can see they've made the antennas much sturdier to hopefully hold up against the wind and rain. On January 18th, 1903, the Wellfleet Marconi station successfully sent the first public two-way wireless communication between Europe and America. President Roosevelt's message was translated into Morse code, which I will not be attempting to read out for you today, and read, His Majesty Edward VII, London, England, in taking advantage of the wonderful triumph of scientific research and ingenuity which has been achieved in perfecting a system of wireless telegraphy, I extend on behalf of the American people most cordial greetings and good wishes to you and all the people of the British Empire. Theodore Roosevelt, Wellfleet, Massachusetts, January 9th, 1903. The King's reply, the President, White House, Washington, America, I thank you most sincerely for the kind message which I have just received from you through Marconi's transatlantic wireless telegraphy. I sincerely reciprocate in the name of the British Empire the cordial greetings and friendly sentiment expressed to you on behalf of the American nation. I heartily wish you and your country every possible prosperity. While this was initially reported in papers like the New York Times as being successful, the message had been transmitted almost immediately to England, and then a message was almost immediately sent back. It was later reported, and by later I mean a correction was reprinted in the New York Times the following day, that the King's reply had actually needed to be sent by traditional cable, not wireless. The Poldhu station in England wasn't strong enough to send a message back to South Wellfleet. So Marconi's original goal for the station wasn't met. And actually none of the wireless stations he personally oversaw building would meet the goal of consistently being able to send wireless messages across the entire Atlantic. It's, this is a technology that's really dependent on wind, weather, the actual power of what you've got in your station. So you could transmit things wirelessly, but it wasn't the same way we can just, text someone today and your phone will immediately light up with it. It was very inconsistent and just not what they were hoping, not the product they were hoping to present to folks. So the Marconi company, I was like, all right, well, we have these stations. What's kind of a plan B we can use to, put these to use? Realizing that the technology could actually be really helpful in ship-to-shore transmittals of both personal messages and news broadcasts, many shipping companies, passenger lines, and other ocean-going businesses started to install radio rooms on their ships. Radio men on board would listen for news broadcasts from stations like South Wellfleet, Cape Cod, which would often be typed up and delivered to passengers in little magazines that had blank sections in the middle for today's news, and then pre-printed advertisements and such on other pages. These broadcasts, which were transmitted in Morse code, would be repeated throughout the day. So the radio man could tune in, hear a news report from South Wellfleet, type it up on the booklet, and then slip it under your cabin door so you could have the news of, what was going on in the world. The Wellfleet station became the top North American facility for this function, but residents of Wellfleet still had mixed feelings at best about, being the home to this station. The crashing spark from the 3-foot rotor could still be heard 4 miles downwind from the station, and they ended up having to endure the presence of the South Wellfleet spark gap transmitter for 15 years. So quite a long time for folks who are close enough to hear that just, unending thunderous noise in their backyard. Stations like Wellfleet and the shipboard radio rooms it transmitted to were not only important for general communication, but they could also play a major role in emergency situations, as we will soon see in the Titanic disaster. Marconi operators were in a somewhat unique position on board vessels at this time. While they were expected to respect and follow the authority of the ship's captain and other officers, they were not officially members of the crew. The same way that an officer, cook, or steward was, and they were not employees of the White Star Line or any other company or authority besides Marconi. They were basically just contractors working on board these ships. Similarly, the equipment that they used was essentially on loan from the Marconi company, and Marconi himself discouraged anyone besides licensed repairmen to fix or otherwise interact with the machinery. The operators were mostly young men, and many rotated through different ships and land-based stations rather than spending their entire career on board one vessel or with one specific company. Telegrams between them are a very interesting record of communication of the period, because messages were designed to be quite terse. Sending something out in Morse code takes longer than just, writing a sentence in the, Roman alphabet. So extant examples of communications between Marconi operators, rather than a passenger message meant to be read by somebody on land, show that these guys had their own slang, sort of like an early version of chat speak or on like instant messenger. And they could also often speak quite casually for each other. You have to remember, a lot of these guys are, between the ages of like 18 and 25. So sometimes they're using what passes for foul language in the early 1900s. You'll often see operators calling each other things like OM, meaning old man, or just again, being sort of casual and sassy with each other, sort of like, hey, leave me alone, I'm trying to do work and stuff like that. These two photos we have here are the black and white photo is the Marconi room on board the Titanic, which was taken on board before the ship departed for its first and final journey. And the color photograph is a modern recreation that was set up at a museum exhibit in New York to show you, sort of in real life and to scale what these rooms would have looked like. And the man in the photo is Harold Bride, who was one of the two operators on board the Titanic, who we will hear more about in a moment. Because they were employed by Marconi and not by any sort of nautical or naval authority, their primary role was really to send and receive passenger messages like these. This was essentially the only way people on board ships could communicate with folks on land at this time, and vice versa. We're obviously way before cell phones, email, anything like that. But you don't have if you're getting on a boat, this is the only way you can get a message on or off. So if you had business deals or important family matters, you'd pay to send out a message rather than waiting several days for the ship to arrive in port and to send a letter or telegram there. So if, say, on board the ship, you're like, hey, actually, when I get to New York, I need to like stick around for a couple days. Don't bring the car up and meet me at the pier. This is the best way to do it. Other folks were more enchanted by the novelty of being able to send a telegram while at sea. So some of the messages that would be sent out are more along the lines of, OMG, you'll never guess where I'm sending this message from, the ship. Some of these more frivolous messages were actually the last things Titanic sent out before calling for help. Operators would be paid per message, meaning they were highly motivated to process as many passenger requests as possible. But because there was not a separate, specifically trained radio man by the White Star Line or any other company at the time, they were also responsible for transmitting important messages to the bridge or other ships in the area, like warnings about storms, icebergs, or requests for assistance in their emergency. Titanic had 2 Marconi operators on board, which is fairly common of a ship of their size. You would want to have 2 guys around so that one could, nap while the other continued to work, because this was really an around-the-clock job. Jack Phillips, the senior operator, the man in the hat, learned telegraphy while working at post office. He started training to work for the Marconi Company in March of 1906 and graduated 5 months later. His first assignment was the White Star Line Titanic, but later worked for the Cunard Line, the Allen Line, a land-based Marconi station in Ireland, and then finally the White Star Line again, with tenures on the Adriatic and Oceanic before being assigned to Titanic's maiden voyage. The junior operator, Harold Bride, the other man, you just saw the back of his head in the other photo, only completed his training in July of 1911, but had already worked on 5 ships before being assigned to Titanic. He was only 22 at the time of the sinking. Interestingly, one of the Cunard Line's ships that both men worked on before the Titanic disaster was the Lusitania, which 3 years after the Titanic disaster would be sunk by a German U-boat. So just a fun little bit of trivia about what other ships these guys had served on. So on the night of the sinking, earlier on April 14th, Titanic's wireless equipment completely broke down. Operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride spent most of the day trying to repair it, and then had an enormous backlog of outgoing messages to send out, as well as incoming messages they would need to process as well. Here's where the wireless operators played no small part in the coming disaster. Because of this backlog, it's been claimed by some that Phillips did not pay serious attention to ice warnings coming in from other ships on the night of the 14th. So around 9:30 p.m., the steamship Mesaba reported a large number of icebergs at an ice field directly in Titanic's path. This is one of the icebergs that was photographed after the disaster, which some people like to claim is the exact iceberg that hit Titanic. It's basically impossible to determine which one actually did the damage, but this is just, an example of what kind of stuff is floating around in the water with them. Phillips acknowledged the warning, but continued to transmit messages to Cape Race instead of immediately informing the bridge officers. The Mesaba's radio operator waited for confirmation that Phillips relayed the message to the bridge, but never got it. The Titanic's second officer, Charles Lightoller, reported in his autobiography that at some point after the ship struck the berg, this is a quote from his biography, Phillips explained that when I said that I did not recollect any Mesaba report, I just put the message under a paperweight at my elbow just until I squared up what I was doing before sending it to the bridge. That delay proved fatal and was the main contributory cause to the loss of that magnificent ship and hundreds of lives. Had I, as officer of the watch or the captain, become aware of the peril lying so close ahead and not instantly slowed down or stopped, we should have been guilty of culpable and criminal negligence. About an hour later, Cyril Evans, the operator on board the nearby SS Californian, this ship right here, wired Titanic, "I say, old man, we are stopped and surrounded by ice." The two ships were so close to each other that Evans's message came through quite loudly. At this point, the technology is, at a point where physical distance plays a really big part on how strong and how loud your signal is. So Californian being very, very close, if you have the volume turned up very high, it sounds like he's screaming at you. And if you have it down low, he still is audible. Whereas a station that's much further away, you might not even be able to hear if you have the volume cranked up all the way up. So unfortunately for Phillips, who was on the horn at the time, they were quite close and he had the dial turned up quite loudly. So it sounds like Evans is screaming this message in his ear. So he responds back saying, "Keep out, shut up, I am working," meaning communicating with Cape Race. Cape Race was a land-based Marconi station that was very far away from Titanic and thus very quiet. So he had to keep the volume really high up to hear it. Whereas Californian was only about 10 miles away. So this is really just like blasting him like air horn in the ear. Evans on board the Californian reportedly stayed up a while longer listening to Phillips send routine communication through Cape Race before finally going to bed around 11:30 at night and switching Californian's radio off, like completely flip the switch. It's no longer active at all. So again, the message warning him, or from the Californian warning about the ice, never made it to Titanic's bridge. But in Phillips's defense, and sort of contradicting a little bit of what Charles Lightoller says in his autobiography, some of these messages were not marked as being specifically necessary to go to the bridge. So Evans would have had to tag it as MSG for Master Servicegram, which is basically you have to take this up to the bridge so the captain can see it, versus just, hey, I'm kind of communicating with you, having a observation about what's going on in my neck of the woods. The bridge had also throughout the day been receiving several ice warnings and had a lookout posted. So pointing to this breakdown in communication as like the sole reason the disaster happened is really unfair to both Phillips and the other men involved. It's still a major contributing factor, but the Titanic is one of those instances where like everything that could go wrong did go wrong. It wasn't any one person's specific fault that anything what ultimately happened. When the Titanic struck the iceberg at 11:40 p.m., Captain Edward Smith quickly informed Phillips to prepare to transmit a distress signal. Harold Bride, the junior operator, had just awoken to relieve Phillips for his shift, but both worked together to confront the crisis. Phillips transmitted a call for assistance and Titanic's estimated position, while Bride took messages to the captain about which ships were coming to Titanic's aid. At the time, it was still common for ships to use the older CQD call rather than SOS, which had only been adopted 4 years earlier as the sort of standardized distress call. CQD was a call that indicated a vessel was in some kind of distress, but it wasn't necessarily a signal that they were immediately in really urgent danger of sinking or destruction. Vessels could use it while in need of a doctor or a tow. It's believed that Phillips primarily used CQD first when the full scale of the damage to the ship wasn't realized, because SOS would have indicated they needed urgent and immediate assistance. So if you're just saying, hey, we've run into some trouble, if you could turn around and come help us, that would be great, but like, don't rush, versus come here right now. This is like, we're imminently in danger of sinking. Bride remembered that he joked to Phillips that the new call was SOS and said, send SOS, it's the new call and it may be your last chance to send it. Phillips with a laugh changed the signal to SOS. There's also a myth that SOS was first used during the Titanic sinking, but it had in fact been used by other ships previously. There's some possible truth that it's the first British ship to have ever used it, but that's one of the many myths surrounding the sinking. Meanwhile, on board the RMS Carpathia, wireless operator Harold Codham, this young man down here, was getting ready for bed. Coincidentally, Codham was good friends with Harold Bride and also knew Jack Phillips. They had trained together and worked in different positions together with Marconi. This is a very sort of, small group where you're rotating through all these different jobs. So you end up knowing everybody who's working for the company on these different ships. Codham would later tell a New York Times reporter that it was only a streak of luck that I got the message at all, for on the previous night, I had been up until 2:30 in the morning, and the night before that until 3 o'clock, and I had planned to go to bed early that night. I thought I'd take some general news, as I didn't know how the coal strike in England was going, and I was interested in it. When I had been taking this some time, there was a batch of messages coming through for the Titanic from the long-distance Marconi wireless station at Cape Cod, which transmits the day's news at 10:30 New York time every morning. When Cape Cod had been going some time, he started sending a batch of messages for Titanic, and having heard the Titanic man being pushed with work during the afternoon, I thought I'd give him a hand by taking them and retransmitting them the following morning, as I had nothing much to work on. As I was the nearest station to Titanic, it was more or less my duty to retransmit them to him. When Cape Cod finished, I made up my daily list of communications and reported them to the officer on watch. On returning to the cabin, I put the telephones on to the telephones, meaning headset, that's what they called them at the time. I put the telephones on to verify a time rush, which I had exchanged with the Parisian, another ship, early that afternoon. A time rush is the slang wireless word for the exchange of ships' time, which is always made when you encounter another ship to see if your clocks agree. I put the telephones on and called the Titanic and asked him if he was aware that a batch of messages were being transmitted for him from Cape Cod. And his answer was, come at once, we have struck a berg. To Codham's question of whether it was serious, Phillips replied, yes, it's a CQD, old man. Here's the position, report it, and get here as soon as you can. At the Senate inquiry about the sinking, Captain Arthur Rothstrand of the Carpathia, the other man pictured here, stated, the whole thing was absolutely providential. I will tell you this, that the wireless operator was in his cabin at the time, not on official business at all, but simply listening as he was undressing. He was unlacing his boots at the time. He had this apparatus on his ear and the message came. That was the whole thing. In 10 minutes, maybe he would have been in bed and we would not have heard the messages. Codham raced to inform Carpathia's captain and crew of the situation. While the officer on watch required some convincing, Carpathia's Captain Rothstrand almost immediately ordered to turn Carpathia around and race to the aid of the other vessel. This was an incredibly brave and incredibly risky maneuver, as they were pushing the ship at full power through icy seas. In a different, less fortunate universe, it's definitely possible we could be remembering April 15th, 1912 as the day 2 ships went down in the Atlantic, and Captain Rostrom might have gone down in history as a noble and well-intentioned, but ultimately reckless fool who got everyone on board the Carpathia killed. Despite their speed, it would still take Carpathia almost 4 hours to reach the site of the disaster. Other ships within radio distance respond and move to Titanic's transmitted position, but Carpathia was the closest of the ships that heard the distress call. Codham continued to keep in touch with Phillips and Bride, and around 1:45 a.m., Codham received Titanic's final intelligible message. Come as quickly as possible, old man. The engine room is filling up to the boilers. He replied that all our boats were ready and we were coming as hard as we could come, but received no further response. Despite receiving no reply, Cottam continued to update Titanic on Carpathia's progress, instructing Phillips to look for their signal rockets. As passengers crowded into Titanic's few lifeboats, Phillips continued to work. He was so engrossed that Bride had to put on his overcoat and life belt for him. They were able to make contact with a few other ships, but the Carpathia was closest. Their messages were actually also picked up by other land-based stations, including the Sconset station on Nantucket, so another Cape Cod connection. The wireless power was almost completely out shortly after 2 a.m. when Captain Smith arrived and told Phillips and Bride they had done their duty and were relieved. Bride later remembered being moved by the way Phillips continued working up until the last possible minute, even after being relieved by Captain Smith. He told the New York Times how poor Phillips and I felt suddenly, or how Phillips continued to work through it, I don't know. He was a brave man. I learned to love him that night, and I suddenly felt a great reverence to see him standing there sticking to his work while everybody else was raging about. I will never live to forget the work of Phillips during the last awful 15 minutes. I looked out, the boat deck was awash. Phillips clung on, sending and sending. He clung on for about 10 minutes or maybe 15 minutes after the captain had released him. This is also like, the ship is going down very quickly at this point, so every minute he is standing here doing this work is a minute he is not trying to rescue himself. The British Wreck Commissioner's inquiry found that other ships in the area continued to hear broken or unintelligible CQD and SOS calls from Titanic after the last message Cottam received, but all signals cut off abruptly at 2:17 a.m., 3 minutes before Titanic disappeared under the water. Phillips literally worked up until the last possible minute to try and summon more help. While they were still at the radio, a crew member from below decks, either a stoker or trimmer, snuck in and attempted to steal Phillips's life belt. Bride attacked the man, knocking him senseless. Bride remembered, I did my duty. I hope I finished him. I don't know. We left him on the cabin floor of the radio room and he was not moving. The water was starting to flood the wireless room and both men ran out. Here they split up, Bride heading forward and Phillips heading aft. And this is one of the, some of the interviews afterwards, Bride insisted this is the last time he saw Phillips alive. Bride quickly began helping the other crewmen remove one of the last two lifeboats, Collapsible B, off of the roof of the operative quarters. They were unable to launch it before it was washed off the deck upside down. Bride was also swept off the deck and ended up in the water underneath the overturned lifeboat. Fortunately for him, he was able to swim out from under it and climbed on board. Led by Second Officer Charles Lightoller, the man I read the quote from his autobiography earlier, who is, in my opinion, one of the most interesting people involved in the sinking, just in terms of, you know, he's led a very interesting and crazy life. If you've seen the Christopher Nolan movie Dunkirk, one of the main characters is based on him. So he's attached to that, and he's attached to Dunkirk, had a bunch of other adventures as a younger man. Bride and 20 or so others under Lightoller's command were able to survive the night on board the overturned lifeboat, which was waterlogged and slowly sinking. They fortunately eventually met up with the other lifeboats from Titanic and were then later safely taken aboard the Carpathia. There are conflicting reports of what happened to Jack Phillips. In different accounts, Harold Bride said he never saw him again after they parted ways, but he and other survivors also reported that Phillips survived the initial sinking and also made it onto Collapsible B, but unfortunately succumbed to cold or injuries before they were rescued and was buried at sea. It's possible in the confusion, Bride and others mistook a different man who ultimately succumbed to cold for Phillips, but either way, his body was never recovered and he was only 25. Carpathia arrived to the scene of the disaster around 4 a.m. in the morning, an hour and a half after the ship went down for good, and immediately began rescuing survivors. On their frantic rush over, passengers and crew on board had already begun preparing food, blankets, warm clothes, and other provisions for the Titanic survivors. 705 people were ultimately rescued from the sinking. In the next 4 days, Harold Cottam worked round the clock relaying information about the disaster to the Cunard Line, Carpathia's owner, nearby ships, and messages to and from Titanic passengers and family members of the passengers, literally only resting when he passed out at his post for less than 4 hours. Harold Bride was badly injured escaping the Titanic, suffering frostbite to his feet and a bad foot sprain after they were crushed in Collapsible B. But after some rest, he joined Harold Cottam to help meet the insane demand for information. Both men ignored messages from journalists asking for more information to put in the papers, both because the priority was getting accurate information to loved ones and other ships who hoped to find more survivors in the water, And because they had so many messages to get through, they just didn't have, they made the executive decision, we don't have time to deal with the press, we can't talk to them. They would later come under fire for seemingly ignoring American requests for information, but both defended their actions. At this point, there was a difference between American and continental Morse code. There's not really a fully standardized alphabet to use, essentially, which meant that it would take Harold and, well, both Harolds, longer to get through the messages from American operators versus British. So again, they're trying to, you know, triage this as much as possible to get as many, just the volume of messages down versus, you know, answering them as they come in. Bride also said that the American messages were coming through quite slowly, which further complicated processing requests for information over personal inquiries about loved ones. Upon arriving in New York on April 15th, Cod received permission from the Marconi Wireless Company to sell his story to the New York Times. The story Titanic CQD Caught by a Lucky Fluke was published on April 19th. Bride also sold his story to the Times for $1,000, which is about $30,000 in today's money. So everyone knows about Titanic influencing things like how many lifeboats a ship was required to carry, but there's a very specific consequence of the breakdown in communication and bad policy in relation to the Marconi wireless operators that, you know, changes here. Cottam only received Titanic's distress calls by chance. Like, as the captain said, if he had been in bed 10 minutes earlier, wouldn't have heard anything. Evans on the SS Californian hadn't received them at all because he was asleep. Californian was closer, and had he got the messages, would have been able to move their aid faster. So had Cottam also been asleep, it's possible the disaster would have been much worse. I know, like, the James Cameron movie kind of makes it seem like some people are pulled successfully out of the water. In reality, only about 4 were. Everyone who went in froze to death. Almost everyone who went in froze to death. And you're also out in the water in the mid-Atlantic. Some of you are wet from, you know, being wet on board the sinking. Some of you don't have proper winter clothing. You can get hypothermia and die even in a lifeboat. So had it taken longer for the ship to get there, it's possible all of the survivors would have ended up being counted among the dead. It was evident that consistent safety measures needed to be implemented regarding wireless communications. And this led to the Radio Act of 1912, which required all ships to man wireless distress frequencies around the clock. The Carpathia's captain, crew, and passengers were hailed as heroes for their role in their rescue of the Titanic survivors. From pushing the ships to her limits to reach the site of the disaster, to selflessly giving up passenger berths, clothing, and food for the survivors, it's really a wonderful story of compassion and selflessness that deserves its own Hollywood treatment. Captain Arthur Rostron was especially commended for his role in the rescue. He was honored with the Congressional Gold Medal, the Thanks of Congress, the American Cross of Honor, a medal from the Liverpool Shipwreck and Humane Society, a gold medal from the Shipwreck Society of New York, and a silver cup presented to him by Titanic survivors. That is that cup, and the woman who is handing it to him is Molly Brown, played by Kathy Bates in the James Cameron movie, and also star of a Broadway musical and many other fun. Another great character to read up on if you aren't already familiar with her. He remained with the Cunard Line and served during World War I, when many passenger liners were requisitioned by the British government to act as troop transports. He remained a member of the Royal Navy Reserve up until his retirement in 1924, and even briefly served as the Royal Naval Reserve aide-de-camp to King George V. He died in 1940. During the First World War, the Carpathia was used to transfer Canadian and American expeditionary forces to Europe, and unfortunately for her, was sunk by a U-boat on July 17th, 1918. Interestingly, the SS Californian, who failed to aid the Titanic despite being closer because their radio operator was asleep when the CQD messages went out, was also sunk by U-boats during World War I, but 3 years earlier in 1915. A lot of the ships of this era, when you read their history, that's their fate. Harold Bride, this is also a photo of both Harolds. Harold Bride is the one sitting down with sort of bandages around his legs from his injuries, and Cottam is sitting next to him. This is a photo that was taken during some of the inquiries into the wreck. He continued to work as a shipboard wireless operator on a number of ships until 1922, when he got married and took a job as a sales representative of the Minimax Fire Extinguisher Company. He died in 1984. Harold Bride sorry, that was Harold Cottam, who got the job with the fire extinguisher. Harold Bride continued to work as a Marconi operator as soon as 4 months after the Titanic went down. So both of them just immediately got back up on the horse and continued working these jobs, which is a lot more than I would have done if I were in their position. During World War I, he served as a wireless operator on the steamship Mona's Isle, but in 1922, he retired from radio work and moved to Glasgow, where he became a salesman. He died in 1956 at age 66. Like many Titanic survivors, Bride disliked discussing the Titanic later in life and also disliked the celebrity the role gave him, and Cottam was pretty much the same way. Both of them were like, you know, we're not really interested in, I think it was Cottam who was offered to play himself in A Night to Remember, and he was like, no thanks, not interested. But interestingly, the two did actually remain quite close friends for a long time after the disaster. So that's sort of, you know, the other well-known story, but what happened to the Cape's Marconi stations? Because obviously we don't have them anymore. While most things you'll see online about the Wellfleet station make a big to-do about coastal erosion near the site, forcing Marconi to close and relocate the station, in reality, it was World War I that was really the death knell of the Wellfleet station. In 1914, as part of an unrelated contract between Norway and the Marconi Company, ground was broken in Chatham along Riders Cove for a new Marconi station. The Wellfleet site and other American Marconi stations were shut down during World War I due to security concerns. Again, this is like a very insecure time for radio waves. There's no way to encrypt your messages beyond just using a code. So it just seems safer to be like, let's shut it all down until the war is over. So Wellfleet station gets shut down in 1914 and never reopens. By 1920, it was completely dismantled, and the Chatham station, which was now fully operational, although no longer owned by the Marconi Company, took up its old call sign. This site is maintained by our friends at the Chatham Marconi Maritime Center, who I also want to give a special shout out to for helping me with some of the research for this, and sort of untangling some of the complicated history of what exactly happened with these sites. And today, the sea has claimed most of the land where the South Wellfleet Station once stood, but you can still visit Marconi Beach, part of the Cape Cod National Seashore and managed by the Park Service, and find wayside signs to help orient you to where the station once was. And to close, I want to again say thank you so much to our friend Ed Moxon from Chatham Marconi for helping me clarify some of the myths and legends surrounding the Wellfleet station and some of its more obscure history. There was a brief time earlier this year where the Wikipedia page about the station claimed that the Wellfleet station wasn't the one that sent the messages that Carpathia heard, it was the Chatham station. And I was like, Ed, but you guys didn't open until 2 years after the ship had sunk. So like ground hadn't even been broken and you didn't open until after World War I. So like, what's the deal here? And he was like, yeah, that's someone who doesn't know what they're talking about. So just a little closure of, you know, don't trust everything you read on the internet, and please feel free to get in touch with your local historical societies if you ever want to, you know, fact check some stuff. And thank you guys so much for coming out. I hope this was interesting. If you have any questions, I'd love to, you know, answer, do my best to answer.
What's the building there across from Riders Cove?
Across from it, it's,
Or going to it?
so
It's not in Chatham, it's like in Harwich.
I don't, the one in Riders Cove is the Chatham Marconi
Oh,
site.
that's the Chatham.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
What was the water temperature at that site?
I don't remember off the top of my head, but it was cold. But it's one of those things that's very interesting because I feel like even if like one of my areas of interest beyond sort of, you know, I don't get to do it as often here, but when I was in undergrad and grad school, I did a lot of research into the Pacific War during World War II, and people would be sort of surprised with like, oh, well, how come folks, you know, when the Indianapolis was sank, how did you have folks who were, you know, succumbing to like hypothermia? And because you're in the Pacific, well, when your body is fully submerged, you lose heat so quickly that even if the water is kind of temperate, you know, you can end up getting hypothermia and dying. So for these poor guys, it was, I think, if I remember correctly, it's something where like you could be in the water for 15 minutes and be frozen.
How long did they hit the sink?
About 2 hours.
I mean, it,
Yeah. 4 hours, 4 hours. Because it hit around 11:40 the night before, and it was down at the bottom of the ocean by about 2:40 the next morning. But the ships went under at 2:20, so about 3 hours. But it's one of those things where it's like in the movies and all the documentaries and stuff that you see, it's the people who were sort of more aware of how the ship was built and how it functioned knew pretty quickly, like, oh, this is not something we're coming back from. But the passengers, when you're up on deck, you don't necessarily get that image. So you're like, oh, this is just a drill. We'll probably be fine. We don't need to evacuate. And yeah, it's I think one of the things that's also interesting in reading this is you have all these things of sort of the conflicting stuff of like Lightoller saying, oh, well, if we never got these messages, or, Bride and Lightoll are both saying something about like, oh, well, we saw Phillips died in Collapsible B versus, oh, I didn't see him again for sure after we had split up and stuff like that. And I think one thing to remember too is like, think about like the most stressful day of your entire life and how like, do you have a picture perfect memory of like every single thing you did and all the people you spoke to, even if they were your friends and coworkers and stuff? And this is like that, but like, hopefully for everybody here, multiplied by like 1 million. So you just kind of have to look at all these things and, take things with a grain of salt and realize that's sort of where people are coming from and why there are contradictions sometimes about who said what when and who did what. Because your brain is just like in survival mode as soon as you realize the gravity of what's going on. And well, thank you guys. If you have any other questions, please feel free to ask, or if anything comes up, shoot us an email and we're happy to try to answer.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you guys for coming out on such a nice day.